Hi, I'm Eric Cervini, and welcome to the Queerty Book Club presented by Oraquick. I'm here today with Mike Balaban, a LGBTQ+ historian, with life coach and activist Blossom C. Brown, with writer Abdi Nazemian, and CEO of Autostraddle, Riese Bernard. Today, we're talking about a brand new memoir by one of my favorite activists in American history, Peter Staley, in his book, Never Silent, Act Up in My Life and Activism, chronicling how he went from being a Wall Street trader to one of the most visible activists in all of AIDS activism during the crisis and beyond up until today. Thank you all so much for joining. I want to start really basic with just first impressions and how you liked the book overall.
I really loved it. I thought Peter did such a beautiful job of balancing his stories of activism with the real human stories that were happening behind all these incredible moments in activism that many of us remember.
Riese.
Yeah, I loved it also. I always love reading queer history about anything, especially because I think it has so many lessons for us to learn today. But it was a very accessible read.
And so important in this moment. Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
You said as a guidebook for how we can learn from their tactics, their successes, and their mistakes, and apply them to right now. Mike.
I found it extremely accessible. It made me feel like I was there, and as a fellow Wall Street trader, I could identify with what he went through.
Awesome.
I'm not gonna lie. The gay escapades that was in this book, when he was talking about his gay escapades, I was like, "Oh, let me clutch my purse," because I love it. I love that he was just sexually empowered, and that's something that we really have to talk about, sex positivity. And I love that he had the space in this book to really talk about it, because I really was able to follow his journey.
As y'all know, in 2022 alone, there have been more than 300 bills targeting LGBTQ+ folks, especially trans children. What is it that you think we can learn from this book in our current fight against this hateful legislation?
There's a quote in that book on page 199 that resonated with me, and it basically talked about how when you have right on your side and emotion and community and teamwork and anger, that we can bend the arc of history towards us. I believe we had all of those things in the 80s and 90s. It was a smaller, more simple world. We were stigmatized and therefore had nowhere to turn except each other. So I don't think it's easily and directly transferable, but I think you can take a message from what we did well and try to replicate that to the extent possible.
And Blossom, you're an activist. How have you seen parallels in the fight that we're facing now compared to the AIDS crisis and everything we read about?
When it comes to these anti-LGBTQ bills, especially when it comes to trans youth, it's gonna take strategy. It's gonna take people being on the inside and flipping things out, like what we saw in the first chapter of this book. Being able to have access is gonna be one of the most crucial, important things to be able to navigate through this fight, because we have the willpower. We have the blueprint already. It's about actually making it happen.
So I wanna bring that to more of a personal experience, especially with the threat or the fear that a lot of us have encountered with HIV. You know, I actually got tested for the first time for HIV while I was still a virgin. That's how scared I was. So I'm curious, especially when it comes to testing and the continued importance of testing and how that may have changed over time.
Well, it's remove the stigma.
Yeah,
That part.
stigma,
I was literally gonna say, we found a way to destigmatize and make it fun and empowering. Like at the clubs, when you go out with your friends, there's testing trucks. There's a lot of outreach when it comes to testing. We've learned to not make it feel so uncomfortable. We've learned to make it feel beautiful in our community, because testing is sexy. We've really just found more creative, innovative ways to test and to make people feel empowered about their sexual health.
I guess I remember getting tested, I think, I know it was in 2001. It was in September 2001. And because I had had sex with someone who's in sort of a risk category and developed all kinds of anxiety around it. And I think I had been tested before that because like my first ever sexual partner was a gay man because we were best friends and thought it would be cute, I guess. Like we started getting used to each other. So I had been tested. You know, I'd already had the experience of like not being able to give blood because I had had sex with a man who had sex with men. But the only time I really remember getting tested was when I had this scare and I was like, I have to go, you know, this unprotected sex that I had, and like, I had to look up in the phone book. I remember trying to find a place that did rapid testing, and it was like an hour away. This was in Michigan, so I had to like drive an hour. And I was so nervous that I like passed out when they were taking my blood.
I think this might be a relevant story to tell, but you know, when you asked about the first time getting tested, I got very emotional listening to you. I also got emotional because I was thinking about my first time getting tested, and like you, I was a virgin. I was a virgin a very long time. That fear, I lived there until I was in my mid-20s, until I had my first boyfriend. I was that afraid of sex, and before having sex, he decided we should go get tested, and you know, at that point, you still have to wait a few days for your results, and I mean, I think I cried for days until the results came. I was convinced that I would be positive. I thought that that was my destiny. And looking back on it, it's so emotional to think that that's how my brain, like I knew the science, I understood it, but the fear was so real, the stigma was so real. And there's something about what you experience when you're young. Like those of us who were kids when HIV/AIDS was at its worst, like we are predisposed. We were immediately like our alarm rang. We heard outbreak in the gay community. We were like, boom. Whereas I feel like for the sexual escapades Peter describes, like I feel like he got to experience that and know what that feels like before he was an adult. And that generation, in a way, there's of course the trauma was worse, but there was also a coming of age that got to be freer than it has been since.
I get hundreds of people saying, I wish I lived in the 70s and 80s.
Yeah.
And I have to remind them that they could have been put in a mental institution, fired from their jobs, disowned by their families, and or died of AIDS.
Yes.
So there's a lot of good that came with that, which you're highlighting.
Of course.
But the costs of it were pretty great too.
Yeah, I've thought of that all the time because I also idealized that time period often. I recognize that my idealization comes with a lot of caveats. I recognize that, but I also think there is something that's happening now. You know, families still disown their kids, stigma's still alive. Like you've talked about sex positivity, we don't have enough of that yet. You know, so it's a lot of that stuff still exists. It looks different, but it's still there.
And yet I wouldn't be surprised 40 years from now if they look back and say, boy, you really grew up in a great time. I wish I lived in
I wish I grew up in the TikTok era.
I think if there's anything I learned from this book, but also any book on ACT UP or activism, queer or trans activism through the decades, through the centuries, it's that we as activists, as creators, are standing on the backs of giants. And we have so much to learn from them, but also to be grateful for. So I'm wondering, how do we as a community, but also as individuals, pay them back?
I think we honored those who came before us by learning the history. You know, that's part of like reading books like this, and also books by people from all, you know, Sarah Schulman's book, which is another one that talks about the history of ACT UP. And books about all phases of gay history. And like I know from like running like a lesbian media publication, learning about the history of a lot of gay media is just wild. The same things have just happened over and over and over again. And there's just so much to learn from our past. And I think part of that's how we honor them is we learn about it and we apply that knowledge to what we're doing. And we acknowledge the people that came before us.
You know, just sitting here and listening to everything you've gone through from like the 70s and the 80s. And, you know, I wasn't even around then, but hearing that as a millennial and as an activist, it really is inspiring me, believe it or not, in my fight for, you know, for trans rights and for us to be able to have access to care when it comes to HIV meds and everything. So, you know, there's a lot of work that needs to be done, but I think part of it is storytelling from what happened back in the day. So those of us that are coming up in these newer generations can have that wisdom, can have that courage to be able to fight the good fight. And, you know, it's a lot of work, but we're here to do it.
Thank you for joining us at the Queerty Book Club, and thanks to our sponsor, OraQuick, the only at-home HIV self-test approved by the FDA. And thank you all for joining and for such a wonderful, informative conversation. I learned so much from each and every one of you.
Thank you, Eric.
Thank you.
For having us.